On the night of October 12, 1982, at approximately 11:47 p.m., Sarah Brennan pressed her ear against the bedroom wall of her apartment in Arlington, Virginia, and heard her neighbor speaking rapid, fluent Russian to at least two other people in the adjacent unit. The conversation was animated, punctuated by what sounded like disagreement or urgent negotiation, and it continued for nearly 8 minutes before the voices dropped to a murmur she could no longer distinguish through the plaster and drywall that separated her life from whatever was unfolding 3 feet away. She stood there in the darkness of her bedroom, barefoot on the worn carpet, trying to reconcile what she was hearing with everything her neighbor had told her about himself since she'd moved into the building 3 weeks earlier. His name was James Morrison. He had introduced himself as a cultural liaison at the State Department, originally from Cleveland, a recent widower who'd relocated to the Washington area for work after his wife passed away from cancer the previous spring. He seemed lonely in the particular way that middle-aged men who've lost their partners often seem lonely, eager for brief conversations in the hallway but never pressing for more than polite small talk. And now he was speaking Russian with the ease and speed of a native speaker, his voice carrying none of the hesitation or careful pronunciation that would suggest he was practicing a language he'd learned in school or for professional purposes. Sarah had moved into the apartment complex in mid-September, 2 weeks after her divorce from Thomas Brennan was finalized in Fairfax County Circuit Court. The marriage had lasted 6 years, ending not in dramatic confrontation but in the slow erosion of two people who'd discovered they wanted fundamentally different things from life and lacked the tools or the will to bridge that gap. Thomas had wanted children immediately, a house in the suburbs, a conventional trajectory that felt to Sarah like a script written by someone else. She had wanted time, space to figure out who she was outside the expectations that had shaped her 20s, and the more she'd tried to articulate that need, the more Thomas had pulled away until they were living parallel lives in the same house, communicating through notes left on the kitchen counter and polite exchanges about whose turn it was to take out the trash. The divorce had been civil, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. There was no villain to blame, no betrayal to process, just the quiet acknowledgement that they'd made a mistake and the best thing they could do was end it before resentment calcified into something uglier. The apartment she'd found was in a 3-story brick building constructed sometime in the 1950s, one of dozens of identical complexes that lined the residential streets between Columbia Pike and Arlington Boulevard, housing the endless flow of government workers, contractors, and transient professionals who cycled through the Washington metropolitan area. Her unit was small, a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor with a galley kitchen, a living room barely large enough for a couch and a television, and a bedroom that faced east toward the parking lot. The walls were thin, a fact she'd noticed immediately when she moved in, hearing the television from the unit below and the occasional thump of footsteps from the unit above. But the rent was manageable on her salary as a librarian at the Arlington Public Library, and the location was convenient, a 20-minute bus ride to work and close enough to her favorite bookstore in Clarendon that she could walk there on weekend afternoons. She'd met James Morrison for the first time on September 23rd, a Thursday evening when she'd been carrying groceries up the stairs and he'd appeared in the hallway just as she was fumbling with her keys. Sarah began keeping a notebook on October 14th, 2 days after hearing the Russian conversation through the wall. She used a small spiral-bound memo pad she'd taken from the library's supply closet, the kind with pale green lines and a cardboard backing, and she recorded the date, time, and nature of what she heard each time something unusual came from Morrison's apartment. The first entry read, October 12th, approx 11:47 p.m., 11:55 p.m., Russian language, multiple voices, at least 2 male, possibly 3. Conversation animated, some disagreement. could not distinguish specific words through wall. She kept the notebook in her nightstand drawer, hidden beneath a stack of paperback novels she'd been meaning to read, and she found herself adding to it with increasing frequency as October turned into November. On October 19th, at 10:20 in the evening, she heard Russian again. This time, it was Morrison's voice alone, speaking on what she assumed was a telephone, his tone measured and businesslike. The conversation lasted approximately 12 minutes, and while Sarah couldn't make out most of the words through the wall, she caught what sounded like numbers being recited, a sequence that might have been an address or a series of dates. She wrote it down, noting the cadence and the fact that Morrison had paused several times, as if writing something himself or waiting for confirmation from whoever was on the other end of the line. A week later, on October 26th at 11:15 p.m., she heard what she thought might be German, though she was less certain about this. The language had that particular guttural quality, the hard consonants and clipped rhythm that suggested Germanic roots. But Sarah's German was limited to what she'd studied in college 12 years earlier, and she couldn't be sure. What she could be sure of was that Morrison was speaking it with the same fluency he'd demonstrated in Russian, shifting between languages as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The documentation became a compulsion, something she did not entirely understand but could not stop herself from doing. Every night she found herself lying awake past 11, listening, waiting for sounds from the other side of the wall. On November 2nd, she heard Russian again, and this time there was a woman's voice, younger than Morrison's, speaking rapidly in what sounded like questions or instructions. Morrison responded in the same language, his voice patient, almost instructional, as if he were teaching or explaining something complex. The exchange lasted nearly 20 minutes, and Sarah lay in the darkness of her bedroom, staring at the ceiling, trying to construct an innocent explanation for what she was hearing. Perhaps Morrison was a language teacher who tutored in the evenings. Perhaps he worked for an organization that required him to conduct international business from home. Perhaps she was invading his privacy in a way that said more about her own loneliness and need for distraction than about anything suspicious in his behavior. Her ex-husband's voice played in her head during these moments of doubt, that particular tone Thomas had developed toward the end of their marriage when he'd grown tired of what he called her overthinking. "You're catastrophizing again," he would say when she expressed worry about something, as if her concerns were inherently irrational, products of anxiety rather than legitimate observations about the world. She wondered now if he'd been right, if the divorce had damaged something in her capacity for judgment, if she was projecting significance onto random details because she needed to feel like she was paying attention to something, anything that mattered. On November 8th, a Monday morning, Sarah engineered a casual encounter with Morrison by timing her departure for work to coincide with his usual schedule. She waited by her door until she heard his lock turning, then stepped into the hallway just as he emerged from his apartment. He smiled when he saw her, that same warm, slightly sad smile he'd given her when they first met, and they walked together toward the stairwell. Sarah asked how his weekend had been, whether he'd had a chance to explore any of the restaurants she'd mentioned weeks earlier. Morrison said he'd been busy with work, that there was always more paperwork than seemed reasonable, and he asked about her job at the library with what seemed like genuine interest. She tried to steer the conversation toward languages, mentioning that she'd been thinking about taking a class to brush up on her college German, asking if he spoke any foreign languages through his work at the State Department. Morrison's response was smooth, almost practiced. He said he'd studied French in school, that it occasionally came up in his work with cultural exchanges, but that he'd never been particularly gifted with languages and mostly relied on translators when precision mattered. The lie was delivered with such casual confidence that Sarah found herself almost believing it. almost convincing herself that what she'd heard through the wall had been something else entirely. Television programs or recordings, or her own exhausted mind manufacturing significance from ambient noise. But on November 14th, at 10:35 p.m., she heard Morrison speaking Russian again, and this time the words she caught were impossible to misinterpret or dismiss. His voice came through clearly during a moment when whoever he was speaking with had apparently left the room or moved away from the shared wall. Morrison said something about the package and Tuesday delivery, his Russian precise and unaccented, and then Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter clicking in rapid succession, the mechanical whir and snap of someone photographing documents or materials in quick succession, 5 or 6 exposures in less than 10 seconds before Morrison's voice resumed, speaking to someone who'd apparently returned to continue the conversation. Sarah decided on November 16th that she needed someone else to confirm what she was observing, that she could not trust her own judgment after everything Thomas had said about her tendency to see patterns where none existed. She began speaking with Morrison's other neighbors, casual conversations that she initiated in the hallway or by the mailboxes, asking questions that seemed innocent, but were designed to determine whether anyone else had noticed anything unusual about the man in apartment 2C. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived in the unit directly below Morrison's, mentioned during a conversation on November 18th that he kept very odd hours for someone who worked at the State Department. She said she often heard him pacing late at night, sometimes past midnight, and that he received many visitors, more than seemed normal for a man who claimed to have just moved to the area and didn't know many people. Mr. Phillips, who lived across the hall from Morrison, told Sarah on November 22nd that he'd once heard Morrison speaking to a visiting man in what Phillips was certain was a foreign language, possibly Russian, though Phillips admitted he couldn't be sure since his only exposure to Russian had been through movies and television shows. The validation from other neighbors gave Sarah the confidence to begin more active observation. Starting on December 3rd, she positioned herself near her apartment door during the evening hours, watching through the peephole whenever she heard sounds from the hallway. Over the next 6 weeks, through January 15, 1983, she documented a pattern that became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, between 9 and 11 at night, different men arrived at Morrison's apartment. They came alone, never in pairs, and they never stayed longer than 30 minutes. Sarah never saw the same man twice. Some wore business suits, others dressed more casually in sweaters and slacks, but they all shared a similar quality of purposefulness, moving through the hallway quickly and, quietly, knocking on Morrison's door in a way that suggested they knew exactly where they were going and didn't want to attract attention. Morrison always answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting just inside, and the men would disappear into his apartment without any greeting loud enough for Sarah to hear through her door. She wrote descriptions of each visitor in her notebook, noting their approximate age, height, hair color, and any distinguishing features she could observe through the small circular lens of her peephole. On December 9th, a man in his 50s with gray hair and glasses. On December 14th, a younger man, perhaps 30, with dark hair and a leather jacket. On December 21st, a heavy-set man wearing a wool overcoat despite the mild weather. On January 4th, 1983, a thin man with a briefcase who walked with a slight limp. The pattern held with such consistency that Sarah found herself able to predict when visitors would arrive, and she began positioning herself by the door before 9 o'clock on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, waiting and watching. On January the 8th at 1:15 in the morning, Sarah woke to the sound of Morrison's door closing. She got out of bed and moved to her peephole in time to see him walking down the hallway toward the stairs, carrying what looked like a camera bag over his shoulder. she made a decision in that moment that surprised her even as she was doing it. She grabbed her coat, pulled on her shoes without bothering to tie the laces, and followed him. She stayed far enough behind that he wouldn't hear her footsteps, descending the stairs slowly and carefully, and when she reached the ground floor, she saw him through the glass door of the building's entrance, crossing the parking lot toward a dark sedan parked near the back fence. She watched from just inside the doorway as he opened the trunk, placed the camera bag inside, and drove away. She wrote down his license plate number in the small notebook she'd brought with her, her hand shaking slightly as she formed the letters and numbers in the dim light from the hallway fixture. The question that kept Sarah awake for the rest of that night was whether she should report what she'd observed, and if so, to whom. The obvious answer was the FBI, the agency responsible for investigating espionage and foreign intelligence activities on American soil. But the thought of making that call filled her with a kind of dread she couldn't entirely explain. What if she was wrong? What if Morrison had perfectly innocent explanations for everything she'd seen and heard, and she was simply a lonely divorced woman projecting thriller novel fantasies onto her neighbor's private life? What if her report ruined an innocent man's career and reputation, destroyed his life because she'd been unable to mind her own business? But what if she was right, and her silence allowed whatever Morrison was doing to continue, allowed damage to be done that she might have prevented by speaking up? She thought about Thomas again, about how he would have reacted if she'd told him about this situation, how he would have dismissed her concerns as paranoia, how he would have made her feel foolish for even considering the possibility that something unusual was happening. But Thomas was gone, and Sarah was alone with a decision that felt far too large for one person to make. Sarah made the telephone call to the FBI Washington field office on the afternoon of January 23, 1983, from a payphone outside a drugstore 3 blocks from her apartment. She'd considered calling from home but decided against it, worried that somehow Morrison might overhear, or that the call could be traced back to her more easily. Her hands were shaking as she deposited the coins and dialed the number she'd found in the phone book. And when the receptionist answered, Sarah asked to speak with someone about a possible security concern. She was transferred twice before reaching an agent who identified himself only by his last name, Patterson, and who listened with what sounded like polite skepticism, as Sarah explained that she believed her neighbor might be involved in espionage. The word felt absurd coming out of her mouth, like something from a movie rather than real life, and she could hear the doubt in Patterson's voice when he asked what evidence she had for this belief. Sarah described the Russian conversations, the pattern of visitors, the late-night departure with the camera bag, and the license plate number she'd recorded. There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than she'd expected, and when Patterson spoke again, his tone had changed. He asked for her name, her address, and her telephone number, and he told her that someone would contact her within the next few days to discuss the matter further. 2 agents arrived at her apartment on the evening of January 26th, introducing themselves as Special Agent David Chen and Agent Rebecca Torres. Chen was in his early 40s, wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather portfolio, while Torres was younger, perhaps 30, with her hair pulled back in a tight bun and an expression that suggested she'd heard many stories like Sarah's before, and most of them had turned out to be nothing. They sat in Sarah's small living room for 90 minutes, asking her to describe everything she'd observed since moving into the building in September. Sarah showed them her notebook, the pages now filled with dates and times and descriptions of overheard conversations and visiting men, and she watched their faces for signs of whether they believed her or thought she was wasting their time. Chen took notes while Torres asked most of the questions, her inquiries precise and methodical, focusing on specific details like the exact times Morrison's visitors arrived, whether Sarah had ever seen him meeting with the same person twice, and whether she'd noticed any patterns in when the Russian conversations occurred. They asked about Morrison's daily routine, what time he typically left for work and returned home, whether he received mail or packages with unusual frequency, and whether Sarah had observed anything that might suggest he was aware he was being watched. When Sarah mentioned the camera sound she'd heard on November 14th, Chen and Torres exchanged a look that lasted only a second, but told Sarah that this detail meant something significant to them. Before they left, Chen told Sarah that she should continue her normal routine and not change her behavior in any way that might alert Morrison to the fact that he was under investigation. Torres added that Sarah should not discuss what she'd reported with anyone, including other neighbors, and that she should not attempt to gather additional information or follow Morrison again. If Sarah observed anything unusual, she should call the number Chen wrote on a business card he handed her, but otherwise she should simply go about her life as if this conversation had never happened. The instruction to do nothing felt almost worse than the weeks of anxious observation had felt, because now Sarah knew that the FBI was taking her report seriously, which meant there was a real possibility that Morrison was exactly what she suspected. And yet, she was being asked to continue living 3 feet away from him, sleeping in a bedroom that shared a wall with whatever activities he was conducting, pretending that everything was normal. The waiting period that followed was among the most difficult experiences of Sarah's life. She continued going to work at the library, checking out books, and helping patrons find materials, and attending staff meetings where her colleagues discussed circulation statistics and upcoming programming. And the entire time she felt like she was acting a part in a play, speaking lines and going through motions while her real attention was focused on what might be happening in the apartment next to hers. She heard Morrison through the wall on February 4th, speaking Russian in that same businesslike tone she'd documented before, and she wrote down the date and time but did not call the FBI number because nothing about the conversation seemed different from what she'd already reported. On February 17th, she heard him again, and on March 3rd, always the same pattern of late-night conversations in languages that weren't supposed to be part of his carefully constructed identity. On February 21st, and again on March 8th, Sarah noticed an unmarked van parked on the street outside her building, positioned where it had a clear view of the entrance and the parking lot. The van was white with no company markings, and it appeared at different times of day, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening, but always staying for several hours before driving away. Sarah understood that this was FBI surveillance, that Chen and Torres's team was watching Morrison just as she had been watching him, and the knowledge made her feel both relieved and more anxious, as if the situation had escalated beyond her control into something larger and more dangerous than she'd fully appreciated. On March 15th, Morrison's behavior changed in a way that made Sarah's pulse quicken with alarm. She saw him through her peephole checking the hallway before leaving his apartment, his movements quick and nervous, looking left and right as if searching for something or someone he expected to see. The commotion in the hallway woke Sarah at 6:15 on the morning of March 18th, 1983. The sound of multiple footsteps and voices speaking in controlled but urgent tones just outside her door. She got out of bed and moved to the peephole, pressing her eye against the small lens in time to see 4 FBI agents standing outside Morrison's apartment, one of them holding what appeared to be official paperwork, while another positioned himself to the side of the door in a stance that suggested tactical training. The agent with the paperwork knocked 3 times, announced that he was a federal agent executing a search warrant, and when Morrison opened the door seconds later, he was taken into custody with an efficiency that suggested the agents had done this many times before. Morrison said nothing that Sarah could hear, simply allowed himself to be handcuffed and led down the hallway toward the stairs. his face expression neutral in a way that seemed more disturbing than if he'd shown fear or resistance. For the next 4 hours, Sarah watched through her peephole as agents moved in and out of Morrison's apartment, carrying cardboard boxes and plastic evidence bags filled with materials she couldn't identify from her limited vantage point. By 10:30, the hallway was empty again, Morrison's door sealed with the yellow tape that read "Federal Investigation" in bold black letters. Agents Chen and Torres returned to Sarah's apartment on March 20th, and this time their demeanor was different, less guarded and more forthcoming with information. Chen told Sarah that her report had been instrumental in breaking open an investigation the FBI had been conducting for nearly 8 months into a suspected leak of classified information from the State Department. They'd known documents were being compromised, but had been unable to identify the source until Sarah's observations had pointed them toward Morrison, whose real name was Dmitry Polyakov, though Chen emphasized that this too was likely an alias, and that the man's actual identity remained unclear. Polyakov had been operating in the Washington area since at least 1979, possibly longer, using his position as a cultural liaison to gain access to sensitive information and to establish contact with other individuals who had access to classified materials. The apartment Sarah had been living next to had served as his base of operations, a location where he met with assets, photographed documents, and communicated with his handlers through methods that the FBI was still working to fully understand. Over the next 2 weeks, additional details emerged through conversations with Chen and Torres, and through newspaper articles that began appearing in the Washington Post and other publications after Polyakov's arrest became public. The late-night visitors Sarah had documented were a combination of intelligence assets and intermediaries, individuals who brought Polyakov information or received instructions from him. The camera sound she'd heard on November 14th had been exactly what she'd suspected: Polyakov photographing classified documents in his apartment, likely materials that had been passed to him by someone working within the State Department or another government agency. The pattern of Tuesday and Thursday evening meetings had been part of a carefully structured schedule designed to minimize risk, allowing Polyakov to maintain regular contact with multiple assets without any single person visiting frequently enough to establish a noticeable pattern. The dead drops Sarah hadn't witnessed, but that FBI surveillance had documented, involved locations throughout Arlington and Falls Church, public parks, and shopping center parking lots where Polyakov would leave film canisters or receive packages containing documents or instructions. Sarah asked Chen during one of their conversations how long Polyakov might have been operating if she hadn't reported what she'd heard, and Chen's answer was carefully worded but clear in its implications. He said that Soviet illegals, intelligence officers operating under deep cover without diplomatic protection, could remain active for years, or even decades if they maintained proper operational security, that the FBI had cases of illegals who'd been discovered only after they'd retired or made catastrophic mistakes. Sarah's observation that Polyakov spoke Russian through thin apartment walls, Chen said, was the kind of small operational failure that sophisticated intelligence officers sometimes made, becoming comfortable in their cover identities and forgetting that the most mundane aspects of daily life could expose them. The information created a strange cognitive dissonance in Sarah's mind, a collision between the friendly neighbor who'd offered to help carry her groceries and the professional intelligence officer who'd been stealing classified information 3 feet from where she slept. She found herself thinking about their brief conversations in the hallway, analyzing them for signs of deception or calculation, wondering whether Morrison or Polyakov, or whatever his name actually was, had been assessing her as a potential threat or simply making polite conversation because that's what his cover identity required. The thought that disturbed her most was how completely she'd believed his story about being a widower from Cleveland, how natural his sadness had seemed, how authentic his loneliness had appeared. She wondered whether any of it had been real, whether somewhere beneath the layers of deception there had been an actual human being, or whether everything about him had been constructed specifically to elicit sympathy and avoid scrutiny. On April 7, 1983, Dmitry Polyakov pleaded guilty in federal court to multiple counts of espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage, accepting a plea agreement that resulted in a sentence of 30 years in federal prison. The guilty plea meant there would be no trial, no public airing of the specific documents he'd compromised, or the full extent of the damage his activities had caused. Sarah requested a transfer to a different branch of the Arlington Public Library system in early May of 1983, and by the end of that month she'd moved to a new apartment in Alexandria, a ground-floor unit in a building constructed of cinder block, where the walls were thick enough that she couldn't hear her neighbors, even when she pressed her ear directly against the plaster. She told herself the move was practical, that the commute to the new branch was shorter and the rent was slightly lower, but she knew the real reason was that she could no longer sleep in a bedroom that shared a wall with the space where Polyakov had conducted his operations. Every night in that apartment had become an exercise in involuntary attention, her mind cataloging sounds and interpreting silences, unable to simply exist in her own space without analyzing what might be happening on the other side of the walls. The new apartment felt safer, but safety brought its own kind of awareness, the recognition that she would never again be able to live anywhere without some part of her consciousness devoted to listening and wondering and questioning whether the people around her were who they claimed to be. The hypervigilance that had served her well in detecting Polyakov's activities became a burden she couldn't set down. In her new building, she found herself paying attention to her neighbors' comings and goings, noting patterns in their schedules, listening for conversations in foreign languages or sounds that seemed inconsistent with their stated occupations. A man, in the unit above hers, who claimed to work in marketing but kept irregular hours, became a subject of observation, until Sarah caught herself creating elaborate theories about his activities and realized she was doing exactly what Thomas had accused her of, seeing significance where there was only the ordinary chaos of other people's lives. A woman across the hall who received frequent visitors in the evenings triggered the same response, Sarah documenting the pattern in a notebook before forcing herself to throw the notebook away, and acknowledge that she was manufacturing mysteries because some part of her had become addicted to the feeling of uncovering hidden truths. By the summer of 1984, Sarah's anxiety had progressed to the point where she sought help from a therapist, a woman named Dr. Miriam Hoffman, who practiced in Arlington and specialized in trauma and post-traumatic stress. The therapy sessions, held every Tuesday afternoon for nearly 2 years, became a space where Sarah could examine what had happened to her sense of trust and safety. Dr. Hoffman helped her understand that discovering Polyakov's deception had fundamentally altered her relationship to reality, that knowing how completely she'd been fooled by a cover identity had made it difficult for her to accept anything at face value. The therapeutic work focused on helping Sarah distinguish between reasonable caution and pathological suspicion, on rebuilding her capacity to trust her own judgment without becoming paralyzed by the possibility that she might be wrong. In a session in October of 1984, Sarah told Dr. Hoffman that she felt like she couldn't unhear the Russian conversations through the wall, that the memory of those sounds had become a permanent part of her consciousness, a reminder that the membrane between normal life and espionage was far thinner than she'd ever imagined. In March of 1988, Sarah was reading the Washington Post over breakfast when she came across an article about another Soviet illegal who'd been discovered operating in Northern Virginia. This one, a woman who'd been posing as a real estate agent in Arlington for more than 6 years. The article mentioned that the woman had been caught after a neighbor reported suspicious activity, and Sarah felt her hands begin to shake as she read the details, experiencing a flood of memories and sensations from 5 years earlier. She called Dr. Hoffman that afternoon and scheduled an emergency session, recognizing that the anxiety she'd thought she'd processed was still present, just waiting for the right trigger to resurface. Dr. Hoffman helped her understand that this was likely to be a permanent aspect of her psychology, that the experience with Polyakov had created a kind of imprint that would never fully fade, but that she could learn to live with it rather than being controlled by it. Sarah remarried in 1991, a man named David Chen, who worked as an accountant and who she'd met through a friend at the library. She'd been honest with him about her history, about discovering Polyakov and the psychological aftermath, and David had listened without judgment, acknowledging that the experience would have changed anyone. They moved together to a house in a Maryland suburb, a small single-family home where the nearest neighbors were separated by yards and fences rather than shared walls, and Sarah found that the distance helped, that not hearing other people's daily lives made it easier to manage her tendency toward suspicious observation. But even in the new house, she sometimes caught herself standing still in the kitchen or the bedroom, listening for sounds that weren't there, her mind automatically analyzing ambient noise for patterns or anomalies. In 1995, Sarah read in a brief news article that Dmitry Polyakov had been released from federal prison after serving 12 years of his sentence and had been deported to Russia as part of a prisoner exchange. She was 47 years old by then, working as a senior librarian and living what felt like a stable, ordinary life. But the news of Polyakov's release brought back the same questions she'd been asking herself for more than a decade. She wondered whether he ever thought about the neighbor who'd heard him speaking Russian through thin walls, whether he understood that his operational security had failed not because of sophisticated surveillance or a betrayal by an asset, but because he'd forgotten that someone might be listening in the most ordinary of circumstances.